Hello comrades, it's Comrade Reese here, and today I'm just going to be trying to debunk notions that the capitalist ruling class of all imperialist countries encourage a lot of people to invent in their own heads about the Ukrainian famine. As far as I am aware, there were two famines in Ukraine, one in 1922 and one in 1933. The Ukrainian famine of 1922 that the Soviet Union experienced brought severe conditions in some areas as a direct result of the Russian Civil War, which was when imperialist powers set out to crush the Bolsheviks, who were already building the very early foundations of the Soviet Union. 11 years later, in 1933, another famine happened in Ukraine, and this is the famine that I'm going to be talking about in this video. There are two very different stories about the Ukrainian famine of 1933. One side of the story is the logical and truthful version, which indicates that the Ukrainian famine of 1933 happened because of a combination of very bad climatic conditions and sabotage during the collectivization of agriculture by the rich peasants, otherwise known as Kulaks. The other side of the story is the bullshit one that has been invented by Ukrainian nationalists, which many people have fallen for. Ukrainian nationalists argue that the Ukrainian famine of 1933 was a little trick that was hiding up in Stalin's sleeve in order to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people, and resulted in the needless deaths of millions, causing death and destruction on such a scale that dwarfed the Nazi Holocaust. When you go around the internet looking for information for a history project, or if you're just bored as shit and flicking through daytime television channels, you will more than likely come across documentary evidence to support the claim of the Ukrainian nationalists that is often endorsed by academics like Robert Conquest or James Mace from Harvard University. Evidence such as this is often extremely shaky and often relies on discredited accounts from the 1930s pro-fascist press in the United States of America and even Nazi documents. But despite this, the Ukrainian famine of 1933 continues to resurface. The same old photographic images appear time and time again, appearing to show victims of the famine, but these are almost always undocumented, or if traced back, actually come from famine relief documents from the 1922 famine or even earlier. In the film Harvest of Despair, such pictures were even shown on British television, despite having been rejected by some public service networks in the United States because of a blatant lack of objectivity. Ukrainian nationalist organizations in Canada and elsewhere carry on propagating the notion of the deliberate famine genocide committed by Stalin, while still very carefully trying to gloss over their own anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi and Nazi collaborationist origins. An American journalist going by the name of Thomas Walker entered the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1934. After less than a week in Moscow, the rest of his 13-day stay was spent in transit to the Manchurian border, at which point he had actually left the Soviet Union, never to return. A series of articles began in the Hearst press in the United States, around 4 months later, by Thomas Walker. These articles talked about a famine in Ukraine that had killed 6 million people, and this article had pictures of dead bodies and starving children. It was said that Thomas Walker had smuggled in a camera under the most difficult and dangerous circumstances. Now, at first glance you would think, holy shit, socialism must be dreadful. However, at the same time, an American writer named Louis Fisher, who was living in Moscow, was suspicious. Fisher also pointed out that Thomas Walker's photographic evidence seemed a bit odd, because not only did the pictures look like they were from an earlier decade, but they also contained a mixture of scenes taken both in the summer and in the winter. Louis Fisher also noted that the 1933 harvest in Ukraine had been pretty good. Some of the pictures were later identified as showing scenes from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the First World War, and it was known that Hearst newspapers had been digging out old pictures and tweaking them slightly for propaganda purposes. These pictures sometimes appeared labelled as having been taken in Russia, and at other times the same pictures are relocated to Ukraine for political reasons. Therefore, not only were the photographs a load of bullshit and the trip to Ukraine was a load of bullshit, but Thomas Walker himself was a bullshitter, as he actually turned out to be an escaped convict named Robert Greene, who had served time for forgery. Robert Greene was then captured, and after his trial he admitted that his series of pictures that were used in Hearst newspapers were basically a load of bullshit that were not taken in Ukraine. Despite these solid facts, however, the very same photos are still those that are used in commemoration posters, on websites, and even in the film Harvest of Despair. Despite the Thomas Walker scandal, it is needless to say that the Hearst press carried on with its famine genocide campaign. This is not surprising at all when we look back to see that Hearst himself was known by many Americans as America's #1 fascist. Hearst visited Nazi Germany in 1934, and he actually met Adolf Hitler. After his visit, Hearst began to promote famine genocide articles on Ukraine. French Premier Edward Herriot, who had recently returned from travelling in Ukraine, publicised the fact that he had seen no evidence of any famine. After the Thomas Walker articles, Hearst went on to try and convince Americans that the Soviet Union was the land of starvation, genocide and cannibalism. At the time, this was usually recognised as politically motivated sensationalism, but over the passage of years, these bullshit fabrications have been transformed into primary evidence. By noting those features of the 1930s campaign and the selective memories of those who helped the Hearst press propagate the famine genocide story, we can shed some light on the character of today's famine genocide campaign. With the launch of Hearst's 1935 outpourings, the Nazi press in Germany and sympathetic newspapers elsewhere in Europe started publishing similar stories. At this time, there was a book published by Dr. Amend which was titled Human Life in Russia. This book has had a lasting influence on people who propagate the famine genocide myth, and it was republished in 1984. Human Life in Russia makes very little pretense of objectivity, crediting Hearst's correspondence, accounts from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and reproducing allegations made by unnamed travellers and experts. Most photographic evidence of the famine genocide theorists can be traced back to either the book Human Life in Russia or to Thomas Walker. Although the origins of the pictures are not documented, it is still very important to understand that Amend was involved with famine relief work in 1921. The pictures are said to have been taken in the streets of Kharkov in the summer of 1933, but only 10 out of 26 appear to show urban scenes. There are also no signs or landmarks to help set them into context. The book Human Life in Russia also contains additional pictures that did not appear in the German edition. These photos are claimed to have been taken by Dr. Ditloff, who was the director of the German government agricultural concession in the North Caucasus. Now, a lot of people might ask themselves how a Nazi functionary ended up wandering freely around in Ukraine taking photographs. But in any case, in later publications, these same photographs are either unattributed or attributed to a completely different source. In fact, some pictures have been identified as coming from the 1922 famine, and some show winter scenes despite apparently having been taken in the summertime. Other publications use the same pictures either with no accreditation or accredited to Thomas Walker, despite the fact that they were used to portray events in 1932 and 1933, and Thomas Walker claimed to have taken them in the spring of 1934. So it is clear that the photographic evidence is a load of bullshit and was really used to undermine the Soviet Union, but despite this, they continue to be used today. The famine genocide campaign of the 1930s actually relied so much on right-wing sources and was not accepted by mainstream historians at the time, which led some Ukrainian nationalists to speak of a pro-Soviet, left-wing or a Jewish conspiracy to suppress the truth. A book was published in the 1950s by the Ukrainian Nationalists called the black deeds of the Kremlin so that they could propagate their interpretation of history. A section of the book is filled with allegations of Soviet mass executions during the 1930s in Vinnytsia. The graves were unearthed during the Nazi occupation in 1943. They were examined by a Nazi commission and they were used in propaganda films. After the Second World War, however, German soldiers revealed that this was a Nazi propaganda deception, as the bodies were those of Jews who had been executed by the Waffen-SS and the Ukrainian military. A lot of famine genocide theorists are always very keen to claim that millions of people died during the Ukrainian famine of 1933, but, as usual, their methodology is highly suspect. A study by Dana Darimpo that was published in 1964 comes up with a figure of 5.5 million, based on averaging the guesses of 20 Western journalists. One of them is even our little bullshitting buddy, Thomas Walker. Dalrymple claims that Thomas Walker made his survey by wandering off during a guided tour, and that he had previously spent several years touring Russia. A quote by the Archbishop of Canterbury also shows a similar figure. This enthusiastic supporter of Adolf Hitler had tried to raise the famine issue in the House of Lords in 1934, when the Foreign Office had, in fact, stated that there was actually no evidence to support the allegations against the Soviet government. The testimony of Sir John Maynard, an expert who visited Ukraine in the summer of 1933, had rejected stories of famine genocide, but this is still dismissed by the Ukrainian Nationalists. The Cold War campaign resurfaced in the 1980s with quite a bit of publicity and scholarly backing from the Ukrainian Research Institute of Harvard University, which was a centre for anti-communist research for a long time. In 1953, the book The Ninth Circle was published by the Ukrainian Nationalists, but was republished, edited and introduced by Harvard University's Dr. James Mace in 1983. A critical review of this book described it as being devoid of any documentation and lacking in any scholarship. As it was pointed out, the author fails to give any details about his activity during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine and does not even make a single derogatory comment about the Nazis. The Thomas Walker bullshit is once again used as illustrations, despite the author claiming to have been an eyewitness of the famine. Walter Dushnik's 50 years ago, The Famine Holocaust in Ukraine, is another contribution to the famine genocide literature. The foreword to this book is none other than Dana Darimpo. Walter's roots can be traced to Europe's pre-war fascist movement, which was when he was active in the organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists. A critical reviewer of this book once again points out that rather than being a scholarly analysis, the material in the book consists of a huge amount of emotionally driven bullshit. The same fake photographs are used as illustrations. Walter calculates the number of famine deaths by projecting an anticipated population growth based on the 1926 census onto the listed population census for Ukraine in 1939. The difference comes to 7.5 million, and therefore it becomes the number of famine victims, when in fact the population of Ukraine actually increased in real terms from 1926 to 1939 by almost 3.4 million. It is not possible to come up with an accurate figure for the number of famine victims, but the claims of people like Dana Darimpo, Dr. James Mace and Walter Dushnik have been shown up as extreme exaggerations that have been fabricated to try and strengthen their political allegations of genocide. In 1986, the famine genocide campaign reached a climax with the publication of Robert Conquest's book Harvest of Sorrow and the film produced by the Famine Research Committee of the St. Vladimir Institute, Harvest of Despair. This film is full of the old undocumented pictures, and it relies a lot on interviews with former Nazis and Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, as well as defectors from the Soviet Union. Instead of any documented evidence of the famine being presented, a montage of undocumented stills are shown, including Thomas Walker and Dr. Ditloff's pictures, 1921 and 1922 famine pictures, and others from Nazi propaganda publications. With a shocking disregard for the truth, some scenes borrow footage from the Russian Civil War and Soviet films from the 1920s. In essence, it seems that the filmmakers dug through the archives looking for bits and pieces of old war and starvation shots that were then spliced into the film to add some sort of effect, bound together by a narrative and filled with interviews. Even though so much has even been admitted by some of those who were involved, the film is still widely shown and praised, including on British television. The filmmakers even received grants and logistical support from the National Film Board of Canada and another publicly funded organisation called Multiculturalism Canada. The film, Harvest of Despair, was clearly no objective documentary, but rather a crude Cold War propaganda exercise. Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Sorrow, Soviet Collectivization and the Terror Famine, has emerged as the best attempt to raise the credibility of the famine genocide campaign. Robert Conquest's right-wing affiliations and his Holocaust denials are now well known. He was employed by the British Secret Service's Disinformation Project at one time, the Information Research Department, with key targets being the Third World and the Russians. The Great Terror, which was one of Robert Conquest's earlier works, had alleged that only 5 to 6 million had died in the 1932 and 1933 period, and only half of them in Ukraine. However, Robert Conquest had upped his estimates to 14 million in 1983, and he even extended the famine conditions to 1937. Such revisions go hand in hand with the 50th anniversary commemorations of the famine. Now we've come to the part of the video that you've all been waiting for, which is the famine itself and how it was caused. The factors of drought and sabotage during the process of collectivization are normally given very little attention by right-wing historians. While drought was a contributing factor, the main cause of the famine was the struggle around collectivization of the countryside during this period. There were millions of small-scale peasant farms in 1928. 3/4 of the land was sown by hand, 1/3 of the crop areas was harvested by sickle and scythe, 40% of the crops were threshed by flail, over 1/4 of peasant households had no drought animals or farming implements, and 47% only had ploughs. The drive to collectivization was a key feature of the first 5-year plan that was launched in 1929. The tiny minority of rich peasants, otherwise known as Kulaks, were against the socialization of agriculture, and they fought against collectivization with an organized campaign of large-scale destruction. In some areas, including Ukraine, the struggle approached a civil war scale. Foreign observers who were visiting at the time noted that Kulak opposition took the form of killing their own cattle and horses, rather than having them collectivized. Due to the opposition from the Kulaks, the number of horses in the Soviet Union fell from 30 million to 15 million from 1928 to 1933. The number of cattle in the Soviet Union fell from 70 million to 38 million from 1928 to 1933, and the number of sheep and goats in the Soviet Union fell from 147 million to 50 million from 1928 to 1933. Some Kulaks even burnt down the property of collectives and even burnt their own crops and seed grain. Many famine genocide theorists completely obscure Kulak sabotage, but others offer some pretty enthusiastic descriptions celebrating the opposition to Soviet planning. The famine was also compounded by typhus epidemics which, without a doubt, killed a lot of people. There was a successful harvest by 1933. Huge efforts were put into improving collective farms and providing mechanized equipment. The huge increases in agricultural and industrial output in Ukraine leading up to the Second World War gave the lie to allegations of 7 to 15 million starvation-related deaths only 7 years earlier. In addition, the record of Ukrainian resistance to the Nazis and their Ukrainian nationalist supporters was evident. Loyalty to the Soviet Union was overwhelming and active in the largest eastern portion of Ukraine. There were over 500,000 organized Soviet guerrillas in Ukraine, and 4.5 million ethnic Ukrainians fought in the Soviet Red Army. The Ukrainian nationalist historians do acknowledge this, and people can only wonder about the ability of a nation to mobilize such numbers of military-aged males in the light of nationalist claims about famine victims. The reality was that the Soviet system had demonstrated overwhelming economic and cultural advantages for the bulk of the Ukrainian peasants, workers and the professionals newly emerged from those classes. The Nazis had entered Lviv, which was the capital of western Ukraine, in June 1941. In its vanguard came the German uniformed Nachtigall Battalion of Ukrainian Nationalists. During the first 3 days of July, the Nachtigall Battalion slaughtered 7,000 Jews in the area of Lvov. Non-Jewish writers, intellectuals and professionals known to be hostile to Nazism were also killed. In the first 8 months of Nazi occupation, 15% of Galician Jews, that was 100,000 people at the time, were slaughtered by the joint actions of the Nazis and the Ukrainian nationalists. Many Ukrainian nationalists who fled to Germany and elsewhere when the Nazis were being pushed back by the Soviet Red Army had to cover up their personal and collective guilt in the betrayal of their country. Anti-Semitic and pro-fascist themes run deep through the history of the Ukrainian nationalist movement. Leaders of the Ukrainian nationalists were even on the payroll of the Nazi Party before Adolf Hitler ordered for the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Ukrainian nationalist battalions were trained in Germany before the Second World War, and some were even used in the invasion of Poland. The Nachtigall and Roland Ukrainian volunteer detachments fought with the German army, and in late 1941 they were reorganized into a police battalion and employed in Bielorussia. This is very well known. However, the famine genociders portray the Ukrainian nationalists as having fought against both Hitler and Stalin, and that somehow they are on par with the French resistance. The role of the 14th Waffen-SS Galeisen Division is also distorted. It was formed in 1943, and its main function was brutal anti-partisan work. Even after the German withdrawal from Ukraine, nationalists stayed behind and continued to harass Soviet supply lines. Ukrainian nationalist troops served Adolf Hitler in Ukraine, Poland, Bielorussia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Yugoslavia. Ukrainian Nazi collaborators helped in the murder of hundreds and thousands in death camps too. Such were the so-called anti-Nazi credentials of those who Ukrainian nationalists today would present as national liberation fighters, heroes of the Ukrainian people, and patriots who struggled for a free Ukraine. After the Allied victory over Nazi Germany, many Nazi collaborators set out to try and escape justice and retribution by looking for new lives in North America and elsewhere. Western intelligence agencies helped sanitize Nazi collaborators for emigration to new homelands in return for a new collaboration against the Soviet Union. The International Refugee Organization, as well as the US Displaced Persons Commission, initially regarded the Ukrainian Nazis as being not able to have visas. However, this did not stop US intelligence agencies from portraying the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists as having been engaged in anti-Nazi combat. This was complete bullshit, but it persuaded the immigration authorities to change their stance. Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe who were laundered were put to work at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, The Voice of America, and schools training US intelligence officers in Eastern European languages. Some Eastern European Nazi collaborators were even trained for sabotage operations within the Soviet Union, and others were employed as living witnesses of communist terror in the psychological conditioning of the people of the United States to prepare for war against the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian Famine genocide of 1933 was one of many themes. it ultimately became more important to the immigration authorities in the United States of America and Canada whether someone might be considered a communist rather than a Nazi collaborator.